Today, I'm talking to Andy Lopata to learn actually about asking for help and to not go at it alone. Andy is a professional relationship strategist who has worked with a wide range of global clients and has written 5 books on networking and professional relationships. And actually, Andy's last book, Just Ask Why Seeking Support is Your Greatest Strength, was the trigger for this interview and his work and experience in vulnerability, because also that's something that I personally am a big believer of. I believe in the power of vulnerability, showing yourself, both in business, but also obviously in private relationships. So I'm very much looking forward to our talk. Andy, thanks so much for being here with me today. I look forward to picking your brain. Let me scroll up. I would like to start, Andy, if it's okay to ask you 2 personal questions.
Sure.
I think it's always nice to, especially with a topic like this. So could you share with me how asking for help, because I imagine that's also something that you had to learn, at least for me that's the case, how that has changed and impacted your personal life and also your work. And secondly, what role vulnerability has had in this process? Those are kind of 2 questions.
It's a really, really interesting question. I always thought I was very open and very honest and willing to reach out. I did a self-development program a number of years ago, quite a well-known global one called Landmark. And it made me realize that I was a hell of a lot more closed than I gave myself credit for. So I think I started to be a lot more open in how I communicated, a lot more vulnerable. In the way I engage with people on a personal level. I think that Just Ask is primarily written from the standpoint of a professional and the power of asking for support in your professional life. But as I wrote it, I recognize this is just as important in your personal life, and the stories in the book probably cover more the personal than the professional, funnily enough. So the original drive was professional focus. So how has it impacted me on my personal life? I think the quality of my relationships. I don't think I can point to specific instances and said that's been a sea change for me, but I think I have healthier relationships as a result. I'm a lot more open with people. I've always been willing to ask for help, just as, and importantly, always willing to offer that help to others as well. So I don't think that's necessarily been a problem for me in my personal life, but I have a lot more authentic conversations with people, and that leads to deeper relationships. And that's true personally and professionally, but perhaps on podcasts, I'm more often asked about the professional.
And you mentioned this healthier relationship, and what defines a healthy relationship, and how does it shift towards more healthy relationships?
Well, I think that what's unhealthy for a relationship is pretense. And many relationships are founded on pretense because whether professionally or personally, we want to offer the best version of ourselves, which is completely understandable. And of course, when you meet people for the first time, I'm not suggesting you sit down and go through everything that's wrong with you or all your woes, all your challenges. But I think that as you become friends with people, as you build trust with people, being open and honest with them, telling the truth when you're feeling down, telling them when you're struggling with something, asking for their help and support, it breaks down barriers. And when you break down barriers between people, that allows the relationship to flourish. It allows you to connect, if you like, heart to heart rather than head to head. Because you're not overthinking everything. Of course, there are extremes both ways. There are people who are too shut down and don't let anybody in, and that frustrates people around them, and they also get the wrong impression of that person because they're not seeing their true personality. But there are other extremes where you can be too open, where when someone says, "How are you?" they're not always asking for every single illness that you have at the moment or every single doubt. Fear. Sometimes they're just being courteous. How are you? I'm fine. That's okay. And you've got to be able to judge that. Someone was saying to me the other day that there's a member of their family who only ever moans, only ever talks about what's wrong with their life. And it's like the fable of the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah.
That's, at some point people stop listening.
Yeah.
So you have to you have to be thoughtful in the way that you open up and the way you engage with people, but you can still drop a lot of those barriers, and the ones that remain are there at the appropriate times, but it can also be lowered at the appropriate times as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's with everything. I guess there's a balance to it, and there's a time and place.
Yeah, of course.
But there is more of a time and place than we often think. And I think what I see also, because I've done quite some work in the area of vulnerability, also in terms of teaching it. In Switzerland, I've done quite a bit of teaching in the realm of vulnerability. And what we see a lot is that people believe that they need to, in certain roles, especially in a professional setting, that they are supposed to know the answers. They're supposed to have a certain way of being, which what they think they're supposed to be, what the world expects of them. And in reality, oftentimes people new in their roles, they don't know, and they're afraid to ask, but still they're putting up this facade of behind a mask, and they're pretending, which actually puts people further away from them instead of connecting them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a key focus for me going into 2022 is to extend a section of the book where I talk about, can you be vulnerable and be a leader at the same time?
Yeah.
So vulnerable leadership is becoming a key topic for me.
Yeah.
And I've run a couple of sessions with senior business leaders, where I've sounded them out about the prospect. I think there's, I refer to it as a 1980s red braces Wall Street culture of the strong macho alpha male leader who, as you say, knows all the answers.
Yeah.
My take on it is that a leader isn't there because they know all the answers.
No.
A leader is there because they can find the right answers and make the decision based on the information that they can gather. But you gather that information from your team and through your team with their help and support.
Exactly.
And you collate it together. The leader makes the final decision.
Yeah.
They don't start with the right answer.
Yeah.
And that's where you allow vulnerability to come in. A macho leader would say, we've got this problem. Okay, let's do this. A vulnerable leader would say, we've got this problem. Okay, I have some ideas. What do you guys think? Let's talk it through and find the best solution.
Yeah.
And that's where we need to move towards.
I agree. I have something to add there, and there's also a question about this later, because I think it's also about kind of creating a culture where people feel safe enough to make mistakes, and where they dare to try things, and they know they're not being burned down after they make a mistake, because that's actually where also when we move into new areas or new fields or new markets, obviously you need to be able to make mistakes and get up and learn from the experience when you do. And so there's a
completely there's a story in Just Ask. I think it's Phil Jones, who's the CEO of Brother UK, the printer manufacturer. I think it was Phil's story, and he's talking about they were shipping a very expensive piece of equipment, of which I think there were only 2 in the world, across the world, and they needed it for a just-in-time project for a client. And there was a mistake made, or something went wrong in the shipping.
Yeah.
And the culture at Brother was such that the person who was responsible owned up straight away.
Yeah.
And because they said what had happened straight away, they were able to quickly respond, quickly put something in place to get things back on track and communicate with the client and keep them engaged the whole time. And he said it's only because we have a culture where we encourage the communication of mistakes. I was going to say we encourage mistakes. That would be wrong. They encourage the communication of mistakes without worry of retribution, that they felt able to do that. Yeah. And I interviewed the management team at Hong Kong Broadband and Hong Kong Broadband Network, and they said to me that they won't hire someone who won't admit to making a mistake in the interview stage. Because they say if you haven't made a mistake, how can you learn? So I make a big point in the book about that culture of not punishing mistakes but learning from them.
Yeah. And this is the same, obviously, for personal relationships on a private level. Because that's, yeah.
Completely. I mean, how many friendships have broken up because someone's too embarrassed to admit something, so they just stop talking to the other person?
Yeah.
You
And
know,
they
I've
remain
had it in
angry,
my
but
own
they
life.
forget what the reason was years down
Yeah,
the
you
road.
know,
Yeah,
it can be such a small thing.
yeah.
But, you know, I've had it in my own life where someone stopped talking to me because of something I said, but she didn't raise it with me. She
Yeah.
just cut me out of her life. And I did that to someone. But in the end, we had the conversation. It took a long time because the natural is to say, no, you've made a mistake. I'm not, you know, I'm going to punish you effectively.
Yeah.
It's human nature to act like that. But, you know, I've lost one and nearly lost another close friendship because of that lack of communication.
Yeah. Why do you think is it, Andy, that most people have a hard time asking for help and reaching out?
I think there's three reasons. I think number one, and I'm, you know, this is a very broad brush approach, but I think most of the reasons people are giving me would fall into these three categories. So number one is we don't like to be a burden to other people.
Yeah.
So we don't ask because we don't want to be a pain in the backside, basically. And the flip side of that is looking at how you feel when someone asks you for help. And particularly, A, when it's someone you know, like, and trust, and you want to help, not a stranger.
Yeah.
And B, when they make it easy for you to help.
Yeah.
And it's not relentless as well. We talked about that a bit earlier. And the fact is that if someone we like, someone we love, asks us for our support and asks us for something that is easy for us to give, we get pleasure from helping them.
Yeah.
So we don't ask because we don't want to be a burden to others, but when others ask us, we get pleasure from it. So in fact, we're probably being selfish rather than denying a burden, or preventing a burden. So we need to reposition that in our minds and give people the pleasure of helping us. The second is we don't want to be seen as vulnerable. And we've talked about vulnerability already. We see vulnerability as a weakness. It's not a weakness. Vulnerability is a strength.
Agree. Yeah.
It takes courage to ask for help.
Yeah.
And by asking and getting the help we need, we overcome our hurdles or we achieve our objective more easily, which makes us stronger. So vulnerability is a strength. So we need to reframe that as well in our minds. And we can also look at how we position the ask. So if I turn around to you and I turn around and said, Julius, I really am rubbish at this. I don't know what I'm doing. Everything's going wrong. Can you help me? I'd probably sound weak. But if I say, Julius, everything I'm doing is going really well, but I want to build on it now. Can you help me? That doesn't sound weak at all. So it's how you position that. And then the third is we assume people can't or don't want to help us. And it's not for us to assume. That's let them decide. But just make it okay for people to say no. Make it okay in your own mind for them to say no, and don't treat it as a rejection, but understand there could be many reasons they might say no, and make it and communicate to them as well that it is okay to say no. And then you can overcome that assumption barrier.
Yeah. I love these 3 points, I have to say, Andy. It's super concrete. And I have a follow-up question, but I want to summarize. You said make it possible for make a person make the request when you ask someone that it sounds strong. You said so instead of coming from a needy, weak place. What came up for me is that people like to help people who help themselves.
Yeah.
So I guess it's about showing that you're doing the work and you're putting in the efforts. So I really like that angle. I think people often overlook, because when you have the desire to ask for help, you, many cases, are in this problem mindset instead of in the solutions mindset. And I guess shifting that focus and sounding strong about it is a really great point.
Can I just say on that context is everything there? Context is everything. So in particularly in a professional environment, not exclusively, but particularly in a professional environment, people want to know that you're not just abrogating responsibility for the work.
Exactly.
That you're trying to find the solution, and they can help you do that, but not do it for you.
Yeah.
In a personal environment, I think it's slightly different. There will be times when that will be the case, but there will be times, we have a lot of talk about mental health and suicide and depression. I think when you get to that extreme of vulnerability, I wouldn't want anyone to be put off asking for help because they don't feel able to be positive.
Yeah.
So I think it's just that
Nuance.
that slight contextual aside on that.
Yeah.
That if you are despairing, then own the despair and just say, I don't know what to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is indeed being honest and just saying it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing you said, which I also really like, is the point about making it easy for someone to help. And I know that you also have done a lot of work also in relation to LinkedIn, for instance, and professional networking. So in that sense, because actually we connected through LinkedIn based on the recommendation of Pravin, for which I'm grateful. That's awesome. So there's already a warm introduction. But in making this kind of connection with someone on LinkedIn, what could we do? You have some tips or pointers how we can formulate that to make it even easier for people to, because what I'm thinking is you could suggest, for instance, in my example, I'm asking you to do a quick interview or a short interview.
Yeah.
What could I have done better, for instance, in my request towards you? Or
well, I mean, I accepted your request, and
well,
I think
we're here talking, so that's great. Yeah.
So there's two or three things. The key one is that you use Pravin's name.
Yeah.
And as soon as you say Pravin recommended you to me,
yeah,
I'm more likely to respond.
Yeah.
Yesterday, someone, I met someone at a book launch that I emceed a few weeks ago, and she's writing a book on my topic, networking at the moment, professional relations. And she asked me to endorse it. Now, because I've met her, I agreed to have a look at it, and if appropriate, which it is, I'll endorse it.
Yeah.
I met her for a coffee yesterday, and we were talking about other connections, and I mentioned one in particular, and she said that would be amazing if that person would endorse it. And I said, well, I'll ask him for you. And I said, there's two things here. One, if you went to him cold, he probably gets asked a lot. I won't mention names, but very, very well known globally in my field.
Yeah.
Number one, he will get asked a hell of a lot. And if you go cold, the chances are he may politely decline. I mean, with Just Ask, I got ignored by some. I got politely declined by others. I got declined by people who I did get introduced to. So, but that was people at the very, very top of the, household names that you'd know. And the other thing is that he got Brian Tracy to endorse one of my books. So I'm paying it forward in the same sense. And I think he'd recognize that. Yeah. So the first thing is that if Pravin had approached me on your behalf, that would be more powerful than you mentioning Pravin's name. So I talk a lot about referral. What you've done is you've used someone's name, a warm lead, effectively. But actually getting that person to contact me first would have had even more impact. But the use of his name in this context was enough. The second thing is that if you're reaching out cold and you don't have that that name to drop, and even if you do, take what I call the I test. And the I test is how many times do you say I compared to how many times you say you or we. Someone connected with me on LinkedIn, or tried to connect with me on LinkedIn, and I don't accept cold connection requests. But I don't ignore them either. So I sent her a note and said, tell me more about why you would like to connect. And the response had 16 I's and no yous or we's. All about her. I want to connect with you because I do this and I do this and I want to grow my network and I want to and I want and I want and I want. Didn't even show any indication she'd read my profile. It made me feel like a number. So if she failed the eye test, there were too many eyes. So when you reach out to someone, make it about them, not about yourself. So I can't remember your approach exactly, but if we take this particular scenario, the correct approach would be, Andy, I've read your book. I'm really fascinated about this topic about vulnerability. What you said about X really resonated.
Yeah.
What you said about Y is very powerful. I particularly think that what you offer is valuable to this community,
Yeah.
and we could do that. And so it's much more turning the tables. It's not, I have this podcast and I want you on my podcast and so forth. It's
Yeah.
it's the other way around.
Yeah.
So that would be the next thing. So number one is get the referral, get the other person to speak to them first if they've got a trusted relationship. Second is to take the eye test and make it more about the other person than you make it about yourself. There was more, but I think that will suffice
No,
for the
that's
moment.
great.
I can't remember what my next point was.
No, it's much appreciated, super useful. Actually, in relation to this, I want to ask you about the role of reciprocity in the context of asking for help. Do you have any words or ideas to share?
Yeah, I do. I talk about the burden of reciprocity, and I talk about people take on the burden of reciprocity for themselves. You never expect it of them. So you give because you can give.
Yeah.
And then you ask because that's the right person to help you and you feel they would want to help you, and you create a network of connections where you give to some and you receive from others. But everyone you give to, you know that they would help you if they could.
Yeah.
And everyone you receive from, they know that you would help them if you could.
Yeah.
But if you create a virtuous network where everyone is of the mindset of helping each other, you don't count the individual transactions. You look at how your network works as a whole, and if it's helping you achieve what you need to.
Yeah.
And ultimately you might be, in fact, ideally you would be in deficit, in debit. You will have given, you will have deposited more than you will have withdrawn.
Yeah.
But the impact on your career, the impact on your life of what you have withdrawn would more than make up for what you have given.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Asquith Bibesco was the daughter of the former British Prime Minister, Lord Asquith. She's a poet and author. And she said, "Blessed are they who give without remembering and receive without forgetting." And I think that is so powerful. So it's never a quid pro quo. So, you know, if people ask me to come on their podcasts, I don't automatically feel that I should then invite them on my podcast, because it may not be a fit. And vice versa. Just because I have someone as a guest on mine doesn't mean that I'm automatically entitled to be a guest on theirs.
Yeah.
But it means that we're all supporting each other in the ecosystem, and that's where everyone moves forward.
Yeah. Yeah, beautifully said. Very much. In relation to this, in relation to reciprocity, in your book, you state that supporting others, and this is also relating to what we talked about before, supporting others is not as simple as just inviting them to share, for instance. I feel that we need to create a space, and we talked about this actually with regard to making mistakes. We need to create a space where people feel safe to share and to ask. Do you have any pointers how we can do that, how we can make people safe?
Yeah, there's a few things.
Yeah,
there's a few things. Again, there always seems to be a few things. There's a few things on that.
Probably even a few more also.
The first is that just because you're willing to listen, it doesn't mean someone wants to share with you.
Yeah.
I admit that I took it personally when a friend of mine was in a bad place and I offered to be an ear, and she turned around and said, "Well, actually, it's fine. I've got this other friend of ours."
Yeah.
And I took that personally for too long, and I shouldn't have done, because she had someone, as long as she has someone that she can share with and who will give her the support she needs, that should have been all that mattered to me.
Yeah.
But I let my ego get in the way and my enthusiasm to help.
Yeah.
So it's good to be there for people, but don't expect them to automatically be obliged to take up your offer.
Yeah.
The second is the safe space. So I always say that you need to find people that you can confide in, where you value their judgment. So what they say is something that you respect. You value their discretion, so that they're not going to go and talk to other people and share it with everyone else. And you value their objectivity.
Yeah.
So they're not going to judge you. Use of judgment in a different sense, but they're not going to judge you. They're not going to change how they feel about you based on what you share.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking for help, you need to find people who satisfy those three criteria. If you're offering your help, you need to communicate that you satisfy those criteria. And it's not by sitting down and saying, you can value my judgment, you can value my discretion, you can value my objectivity. It's by demonstrating that in the way you engage with people. You might turn around and reassure people that whatever they say it stays with you, and that you're not going to judge them on that, but actions speak louder than words, and the way you are with them, and if they've confided you in you in the past, or have you gossiped about other people to them, you know, it's the little things like that that can make a difference. So in terms of creating a safe environment to share, it's what you do more than what you say. But those are the three, I think those are the three criteria you need to meet in order to be the right person for someone to confide in. In terms of something, the other part of the equation, the other part of the question that you asked, yes, how do I get people to open up a little bit more? In the book, I interviewed Dr. Ivan Meisner, who founded BNI, and Ivan introduced me to a concept of getting people to open up, enabling them to open up by asking them a series of staggered questions. So he would start by saying, "How are you?" And then, people will say, "Yeah, I'm okay." Now, how are you really? And then, well, what are you doing about this? So I found as soon as he shared that with me, I found myself doing it subconsciously all the time, and it really works. And a classic example during the pandemic was, how are you? How are you coping with lockdown? What impact has it had on you? So that third question is an open one rather than a closed one, where people have to give an answer. But you're also signaling that you're not asking how are you out of courtesy,
but you're sincerely interested,
genuinely interested in the response. Because that's the problem, is so many people ask how are you without being interested in the response, that we give them the blanket "I'm fine" courteous answer, and just because that's what we assume that they've done.
And then indeed, by your actions, staying present in the space and letting them speak, also letting them find their words if they need some time for that. That's also indeed the actions, not the words.
That's a really important point. And I would say one of my biggest failings, and it's probably anyone listening to this would have noticed it at times, I try and manage it, is I jump in with my answer before you finish speaking. We all do. Stephen Covey talks about it in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And he encourages active listening, where you just shut up and listen to what the other person's saying, and don't be frightened of a pause at the end of a sentence. And we need to do that more, because it's very easy to think you know what the problem is without really listening. So I'm in several mastermind groups, and I run mastermind sessions in a lot of my programs. For people who haven't come across it, masterminding is a form of peer group mentoring. And I have a very strict agenda, and a core part of that agenda is that once the problem, the challenge has been outlined, the group asks questions, and they can only ask questions. They are not allowed to provide solutions. And that includes, they can't say, "Have you tried this?" and then offer their solution. And it's such an important step. I was in a mastermind group many years ago, and my business at the time was really struggling. We'd launched a new business. It was an online network in the very early days of them, way before. I mean, you talk about 2007. So LinkedIn was maybe 4 years old. Facebook 3 years old. It wasn't mainstream at the time. And it wasn't something I really wanted to do. It was a compromise with my father to exit a business we were in together. And I went to my mastermind group and say, it's not really working, and our marketing isn't working, so I need new marketing ideas. Now, if people had come straight in with solutions, I would have had a whole load of great marketing ideas for a business that was doomed to fail anyway. Because 20 minutes into the questions, someone just turned around and said, "Andy, is your heart really in this?" And it wasn't. And that changed the whole conversation. So without that research stage, you can't get to the root of the problem and a real understanding of the problem. And that's where shutting up and listening, or asking the right questions rather than jumping in with your ideas, is essential.
I've had actually, one of the people that I spoke with was Corinne Janssen, I've talked to her about listening actually. If you're interested, I'll send you the link to the interview. It's been really, really interesting. And she's an absolute expert on listening. And she has some great pointers, and really also what she calls it is narrative listening, where you listen to the story of the other person for the sake of their story, and just to be there with them to experience it. And many times when we share something, also our own ideas become more articulate and our own things fall into place. We actually process things by talking about it. And if someone, just always comes up with solutions for our problems that we are talking about, oftentimes we can solve them ourselves by simply sharing it and being heard and seen. Yeah.
And I'm what's known as a fixer, which is if you start sharing something, I want to fix you.
Yeah.
And I've learned a lot of people don't want to be fixed. They just want to share. They want a shoulder, not a solution. They just want a shoulder. They want to vent. And in terms of that narrative listening, it's really interesting, because I think my version of that is I talk about take yourself out of the equation.
Yeah.
So, for example, when another one of my failings when it comes to this is, someone says, well, we did it before we started recording. You told me you'd been to Myanmar, or you'd worked and lived in Myanmar. So I talked about my experience of Vietnam, and someone else I knew who'd been to Myanmar. I made it about me, not about your experience. See, I do it the whole time. And
but we all do it. Yeah.
We all do it because we're finding a commonality. We're finding a bond. It does have a positive place in our conversation, but it also has a negative, because we take the spotlight away from the other person and put it on ourselves. And by doing that, we're putting their narrative in the dark, and we're missing key things. So if we replay that initial conversation, if instead of saying, well, I talked about a friend that had been to Myanmar and worked there for a year, and I talked about how I'd wanted to go having been to Vietnam, instead, if I'd have said, what was your experience like in Myanmar? Or what did you do there? I didn't ask that stuff. That would have been better conversation. But it's not natural. So taking ourselves out of the equation, not making it about us. I'm conscious I do this, but it's many years of habit.
Well, I mean, halfway the conversation, we point this out, or we were present to it. So I think that's already a huge step. And by becoming more and more aware of it, ultimately we'll do more of that.
Absolutely. But that's the thing, it's taking yourself out of the equation, because if you take yourself out, you listen to the other person more. You don't think, why is this relevant to me? You think, what is important to them?
It's beautiful. Oftentimes, Andy, we don't dare to ask because we're afraid of being judged in some way or another. What can you say about acting in spite of our fears and still asking? You have I'm sure you have a lot to share about this.
Yeah, I mean, this goes to, we don't want to be seen as vulnerable, because that's where the fear of judging comes. I think when I did that landmark program, one of the biggest things I learned from that is nothing anyone else does or says has a meaning other than the meaning we apply to it. And there are so many different ways people process things. And we automatically seem to jump to the worst conclusions. So I think that understanding that, I also learned that everyone on that program had their own battles going on, and it's so easy to put people on pedestals. As a speaker, if you see me speak on stage, you if you're not a confident speaker, you would sit there and think, I could never do that. How can he be so calm? What you're not seeing is the inner monologue that's going throughout my talk. What you're not seeing is my stomach going up and down, the sweating, the physical manifestation of nerves. I spoke at a conference a few weeks ago, and I'd ripped up my talk at 7 o'clock the night before and rewritten it because it had bored me. The next day, I watched from the floor and noticed a number of things that sort of went against the speakers and so forth. But also noticing that everyone was very competent and very good, which is nerve-wracking when you're going up there. And then when I delivered it, I didn't feel comfortable at all. For many reasons we don't necessarily need to go into here, but there was a lot going on in my head.
Yeah.
There was a lot going on. The dialogue was tremendous, and it didn't feel like it flowed naturally. When I watched the video back a few weeks later, you saw none of that.
Yeah.
It looked confident. It looked in flow. It looked very professional. I'm very, very, very happy with it.
Yeah.
But none of that was apparent. None of what was going on in reality was apparent. So we put people on pedestals really easy, really easily. You read the memoirs of any successful athlete or film star, and you read about the alcoholism and the broken marriages and so forth. We don't see all this in the background. And I think that when we're worried about people judging us, let's just recognize that no one's faultless.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean you walk around and tell the whole world all your faults. But, I shared with you just now my faults in conversation. And this is the stuff I teach.
Yeah.
But actually, we all learn by that. And I think that by sharing that, I know that by sharing that, it makes the points I make more engaging, easier to grasp for people. They believe.
I was going to say that it helps people to connect with you for the real you, and people don't want someone who's perfect because it just makes them uncomfortable because they obviously also aren't perfect. So what I've learned also in regard to this speaking and to any points in time where we experience this nervousness or anxiousness or whatever, I articulate it when I dare to. I don't always dare to, but when I do, actually what it helps me is release pressure from that anxiety that I'm experiencing or from that nervousness. And at the same time, it helps the other person connect with me. And it does something, it shifts the energy and it just grounds everyone much more. So articulating what's going on in the moment is a huge thing. Yeah.
The classic example is for someone, it wouldn't work for me because it's what people pay me to do, but for someone who's not comfortable speaking in public and has to give a presentation. If you're giving a presentation in front of colleagues or peers or whoever it might be, clients, when you start, just say, take a sip of water, say, just bear with me, I'm a little bit nervous.
Exactly.
Everyone in the room will relax.
Yeah.
And they will change and they will be with you, willing you on.
Yeah.
And so many people have experienced that. Many people listening to this will probably recognize that. And that happens in so many places. So be yourself, be authentic. And I guess going back to your previous question, because what we've done is we've gone back to the start of our conversation to a large degree about that power of vulnerability to connect on a human level. But I think that if you find that people are judging you because of what you're sharing, then you can just say, well, are these the people that I want around me?
Yeah.
Maybe they're filtering themselves out of your network.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. Very good point. We also shouldn't be afraid of the judgment. If we can be true to ourselves, if someone has different opinions or views, that's all right. Yeah. It
is also important to be able to filter genuine critique from unfair criticism.
Yeah.
So being able to listen, and it's never easy, when someone, I had it recently, when someone gives you, when someone tells you that what you've done is not perfect, it always hurts. But if you can then get past that hurt and listen and learn from it, actually you'll grow and your relationship with that person can become stronger because they'll respect you for the way that you've received their feedback.
And they also feel heard and seen by you actually listening to the problem that they have with you or what they're seeing. Yeah.
You can also listen and say, thank you. I see where you're coming from. I appreciate it. This is why I'm not changing things. And then, because ultimately it's your life.
Of course.
But to acknowledge and tell them. And if they don't take that well, then they're showing you their true personality.
Yeah, absolutely. In your book, there's a chapter about self-compassion and gratitude. And both actually also are a very big part of, I think, my happiness, in all frankness. And you talk about the impact on their impact, so the impact of self-compassion and gratitude on the ability to ask for help, basically. Can you share more about this? that
Yeah,
relation.
and there was a survey conducted by a colleague of mine, John Jameson, in the United States, where he looked at specifically at whether self-compassion and gratitude had an impact on successful leaders.
Yeah.
And he found that the most successful people in his study, and it was a pilot study, um, demonstrated forms of self-compassion and gratitude.
Yeah.
So I think it's just very, very simple things that allow you to do this. So, for example, I tell the story in the book of my friend Kelly, who had several failed pregnancies and IVF, and I'm delighted to report she's had a baby daughter since the book was published. But she went through hell. I mean, one of the worst days of my life when we were at a concert together and her twins were stillborn at 4 months. When she was really, it really affected Kelly a lot in terms of her mental health. And one of the things that I did was I bought her, I think I bought her a diary or a journal. And I just said at the end of every day, just write something that went well.
Yeah.
And then when you're feeling really down, just go back and read through it. Now, it's not something I practiced myself. It wasn't something that I'd like. It just felt the right thing to do. I was trying to find something that would help her, and I felt powerless as a friend. And I knew that she had a lot to be thankful for, but understandably, all the focus was on her failure to conceive. And I needed to find a way to try and bring her back into the good in her life. And she said that that was life-changing for her at the time. And I think
shifts your focus.
Totally changes your focus. And I should do it for myself. I know. But people have different ways of doing this. You have a jar where you put a good thing in every day, and then at the end of the year you bring them all out. Or if you're feeling down, you just sort of pull out pieces of paper with the good things that have happened. They're all nice touches. And actually, I should start doing this.
Yeah, we all should. Yeah,
absolutely. But John's study showed that I think with self-compassion and gratitude are very closely related, because just the act of looking back at what made you happy and being grateful for it allows you to show more compassion for yourself when things are tough.
Yeah.
And I think it brings it makes you more vulnerable to yourself and for yourself. Yeah. And we've talked a lot about that connection between two humans, but it's actually maybe completing the internal connection. This is one area of the book that I don't get asked about that much, interestingly. So this is sort of new thoughts coming out of me as we speak. But maybe it's a way of completing the circuit within yourself and connecting yourself as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in order to be yourself with others, I feel we first need to learn to be ourselves with ourselves,
Completely.
And because I guess even the dynamic that we have where we have parts of ourselves that we don't want to show to other people, we also have this internally because of our socialization, our upbringing, or the culture that we're in, and the values that might be around us. They might not be the same as the ones we hold inside. So coming to, becoming one and accepting our full self, I think is a crucial step towards even being able to, from there, connect with other people on that same basis. That's where it starts. Yeah.
Completely. And I think that it's very hard to do the sorts of things that I've talked about, be truly vulnerable, be able to take on board other people's criticism, be able to own up when you're nervous, all the things we've talked about in this conversation have to stem from an inner confidence in yourself.
Yes.
I think that to be able to do this to its utmost potential, you start with that, completing that connection internally to allow yourself to connect with others. It's not really what I talk about and what I specialize in, but this conversation is making me think about it more. It's something I know because I'm
Wait, that last part I didn't hear, Andy.
People who talk about this so much. I was saying, it's not something that I specialize in. It's not something that I practice enough. It's something I'm aware of intuitively, and that's bound to be the case because of the people that I'm surrounded with. But I've not verbalized it before. So this conversation is very interesting for me as well.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, I'd love to bounce back more ideas back and forth on this topic, but yeah, maybe there's another time for that.
Yeah,
I have basically one question that I always like to close with, and then I have another question, but I'd like to do that on private after we stop the recording.
sure.
What question about asking for help and vulnerability didn't I ask, which I should have asked? I'd like to end with this question.
What question about asking for help and vulnerability should you have asked and didn't you ask?
Yeah,
that's a really tough one, because now I've got to go back through all the questions you asked in my mind and pick it up.
well, it could be maybe there's some area where we didn't shed light yet, which would be
I think, yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot that we haven't covered that I looked at in the book. I think is a very relevant part of the conversation. So, for example, I looked at the differences between men and women when it comes to asking for help. I had a premise that I went into the book with, that women found it easier to ask for help and were naturally more vulnerable. Actually, that's not necessarily the case. It's much more driven by context, and it can be the context of where you work. So for a woman in a male-dominated environment, you know, I interviewed a woman who was formerly very senior in financial services. She couldn't be vulnerable in that environment. In fact, it was the very opposite. She had to be, and many women I've spoken to in that environment have had to, particularly in the past, had to feel they had to be super alpha in order to fit in. And I think most TV stereotypes of female business leaders perpetuate that myth. I looked at the cultural differences in asking for help, and one of the things that came out was the impact of being in a very male-dominated society. Somewhere like India, for example, I interviewed a number of people from India, for Russia. There's a very different attitude to asking for help than there would be in the UK. You look at the impact of the concept of face in China and Chinese cultures. Has a big impact on your ability to be vulnerable. And I interviewed a Chinese woman in the UK who was able to be a lot more vulnerable with her Western friends than with her Eastern family. So there are a lot of things to explore that can be explored around there. Age differences, and you know, you've got the Zoomers coming through, the Generation Zs, and to some degree the younger millennials who have grown up. Well, I mean, all millennials have grown up with more computer power, and younger millennials with the phone power and social media that boomers and Gen Xers didn't. And you have to take that into account. The way Zoomers, particularly Gen Zs, will hide behind their phone. You know, we've all seen it or know stories of, you know, families with or parents picking up kids from school and their friends, and the three friends are sitting in the back all on the phone, and the parents say, "Why aren't you talking to each other?" And they say, "We are." And they're all chatting on their phone on Snapchat or something with the person sitting next to them. And what impact is that having? It is, but what impact is that having on our ability to open up to people? And be vulnerable and connect. So there's a lot of those questions that I asked in the book that we haven't touched on, that I find fascinating. The other one, I had another premise that didn't get proven, but I still stick by it. And I had a conversation on a podcast recently about this, and the person I was talking to was the same. They were saying, you know, you might not have proved it, but I still believe it. And the premise was that sometimes it's easier talking to a stranger.
Absolutely. I know from experience,
But almost everyone I interviewed said no, they would want to open up to someone they knew well. To me, and it's not an academic study, it's an interview of a number of people for a book, but it was amazing. The only two people that talked about opening up to strangers were my former translator from a trip to Siberia, a talk I gave in Irkutsk, and she said that in Russia they have exceptionally long train journeys, and sometimes you'll sit and share your whole life story with the person opposite you because you know you'll never see them again. And that's why I think opening up to a stranger is so powerful. and the other was a counselor in the US. And she said that's what therapy is for.
Yeah.
So she said even she would rather open up to friends and family than to a complete stranger, but that's the role of therapy.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced. I just think it just happened that maybe the people I interviewed were stronger individuals, or I don't know what held that back, but I still stick to my premise, as you seem to agree.
I recognize it fully, actually. It comes not as a surprise to me. And I know from experience, especially shifting when I also went through a phase where I thought I had to be a certain way and I had to show a certain mask to the world and I always have the answers, et cetera, et cetera. And once I couldn't bear that anymore, I actually just got depressed out of it, or because of it. I just couldn't not be myself. And once I started to discover that I was actually sharing it also with strangers who were staying in my Airbnb or whatever, and we got into conversation. It was such a liberating experience, and it really changed a lot. So it makes complete sense to me what you're saying. And I recognize this with other people too, by the way. Yeah.
Completely. One thing, just going back a little bit, when I was talking about Ivan Meisner told me about this method of getting people to open up for you, I was struggling in my head. I couldn't think of the name of it. I just went blank. And I know people might want to research it and find out more. It's semantic differential questioning. Semantic differential questioning, and that's this method of asking questions in different ways to elicit a response. When I researched it further, I saw it used in different contexts, but it definitely works in this environment. Yeah,
appreciate it. Hey, Andy, thanks so much. It was a great talk, and I'm happy that we connected and we got this opportunity, for me at least, to pick your brain and for you to maybe also get triggered in some ways. It was beautiful. Thank you.
My pleasure, Julius, and thanks to Pravin for suggesting it.
I'll definitely be getting back in touch with him and following up. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot.